Hey, folks, we are back with another look at the French army during the First World War. It has been a year since the last episode. So let's recap the series and the last couple of episodes that we did. Overall, this series was created as a way to get more coverage of the French army during World War I and to talk about how it developed throughout the conflict. We have covered the years 1914, 1915, and the last two episodes covered the year 1916. With the crucibles of Verdun and the Somme in 1916, we definitely needed two episodes for that. This episode will cover the year 1917, another watershed year for the French army as it entered its third year of devastating conflict. This is the year of the Nivelle offensive on the Chemin des Dames, a failure which saw army units refuse to attack, the ousting of General Nivelle, and the ascension of General Philippe Petain to command of the French army, and Petain's new operational approach to prosecuting the war. So, as usual, this will no doubt be a great episode, so settle in with a cup of coffee, or if you're about to go on a walk, go ahead and make it a long one. I do hope you enjoy this. And with me this evening are Steve Marsdin, a student and researcher of the 1914 Battle of the Frontiers and its effects, and he's also very knowledgeable about French politics during the war. And then we have Jim Smithson, author of A Taste of Success, The First Battle of the Scarpe, the opening phase of the Battle of Arras, 9 through 14 April 1917, as well as two guidebooks on the Arras battlefields. So let's go ahead and get started. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on the show and taking time out of your weekends to do so. It's very greatly appreciated.
You're very welcome.
Welcome, man.
All right, so we'll get right into it. First question here that I've got is, beginning of 1917, what is the status of the French army? How is it doing regarding manpower, strategy, tactics, and maybe just very lightly, how is France doing overall at the beginning of 1917?
I think basically you have to go back a month or so to get the background to what's going on. And I think a general state of the situation, state of the nation at the moment is rather a pessimistic one around the November time. If you read through the various documents to the Chantilly conference in November 16, where all the usual Haig and Joffre and all the old crowd were there and planning 1917. And as far as Joffre concerned, 1917 was going to be very much a repeat of 1916, except bigger. But on the other hand, I don't think anyone really knew where all the resources were going to come from. And if you read the paperwork there, it sounds a depressing type of conference. It's a sort where, although the generals had a sort of, oh, well, we'll get back into it next year and we'll be away, the politicians were much more negative, and it's a very negative set of meetings go on there. And you can sense that the politicians have basically, to some extent, had enough. And there's a massive political change then at the end of 16, both in Britain and in France. I think what tends to be mistaken is that when the whole changes between 16 and 17 happen, there's a misunderstanding about why it happens in the way it does. And it is a way that the French army changes its leadership in a way that a lot of people find to be very strange. But to talk about that, you first of all have to understand the Third Republic in France. That it existed from 1870, probably the longest period of time over the last 100 years, 120 years, or so, that the French had actually had what could be called a stable government. Now, in French definition, stable government means it had changed between a republic and a royalty, because that had happened 6 times during the last century.
Right.
And in 1870, finally, when they'd been beaten by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War, and the Third Republic grew out of those ashes, they had a republic that might have changed government goodness knows how many times between 1870 and 1914 or 1916, but at least had kept a republic. But because of the events of the previous century, the republic was on tenterhooks. It felt uncertain about its future. It was always, how are we going to defend the republic? And the people that feared the most was the army. Now, so far, the army had been in control of Joffre. Now, the decision, going back a little bit there, the decision in November, December was from the politicians that, in a sense, Joffre had to go. The failure of the Somme to be particularly effective, the fighting at Verdun and what that had done to the French army, that was now not on its knees. A lot of commentators basically say the French army was finished at the end of 16. That's not true whatsoever. They were still only training the cadre of 1917 at that point. It's not as if they'd called in 2 years in advance youngsters and whatever. And that means they're calling in 19, 20-year-olds. It's not as if they're even calling 18-year-olds or anything like that. So, but the leadership had to change. So they basically decided to move Joffre. And the way things start to unravel for almost the rest of this talk and the rest of the year is the decision-making that then happens. Because the French army is not in a bad state, but the leadership is. Joffre is moved into a technical advisor position. And
he's actually promoted upwards, right?
In a sense, he's given what in essence seems to be at first an overarching role in advising and dealing with the way the French army works, and that in his place as French commander-in-chief of the armies would only be somebody of the armies in France, not the whole overall for Italy and for Salonika and all of the other places. He would be a limited sort of commander. And Joffre would have this overarching idea of being the trainer, of being a sort of an instructor in a sense of a grand man in the sense of what he would do. So what you've got is the French then looking for who's this commander-in-chief. And they have a lot of choices, and there are some very obvious choices. And Foch is one of them. But unfortunately, before Joffre is moved out, Joffre had removed Foch. It was an attempt, really, to save his own skin at the last minute by saying everything that happened on the Somme was Foch's fault, and we have to move him away. So Foch was moved out then. But also Foch was seen as someone who might be politically dangerous for the Republic. And a lot of that's to do with his religious background. And that also pertains to Petain, and it also can be linked to Castelnau, who was another possibility at the time. Castelnau at this point had been commander of Eastern Army Group. So he's a full Army Group commander, as Foch had been. So these two had very high levels of command beforehand. Petain also. So all three of those were very obvious choices for anybody looking in who wasn't in the French Republic. But then all three of them had their problems. Nivelle was different. General Nivelle had been risen through the war from divisional commander, corps commander, army commander, until he was second army commander at Verdun. And he was seen as some younger, dynamic type character. So the French army was stable, but at its head was coming in someone with not a massive amount of experience. And also, at this point, not particularly with a great deal of support from a biggish element of both the military and the politicians as well. There was not fully support for him. Weirdly enough, it was the president, Poincaré, who really pushed for Nivelle to come in. I think Poincaré, being the president, had been through the whole 3 years so far. And I think he was sort of looking down as president and saying, I've had enough of what's been going on. He seems to be a young, dynamic, energetic, new ideas, and so on and so forth. And I think so the French army, if you want to answer that question of the start of the year, the French army itself was still in a reasonably good state. It had not had to call up much earlier than the 1916 call-up, which it had done. The 17 call-up had come in, but it was still in training. It wasn't at the front yet. So it wasn't in manpower-wise, it wasn't so badly off, comparatively. we wouldn't think that with the losses of 1915 and 16, but comparatively, it was still in good shape. The leadership, both political and military, was the one that was questionable at that time. I don't know whether Steve wants to come in there and add anything else.
Just adding on a more general political thing, if you look at the political climate today, Nivelle's problem was, as Jim says, he rose through the ranks very quickly. I mean, any organisation that creates jealousy and enemies, it also doesn't give you time to build up a network of contemporary friends for support. So when he got to the very top, he had neither built up a relationship with all the politicians, which is very important, but similarly, the army commanders who had started the war possibly in a superior position to him now found it inferior to him, and it was difficult for him in that respect. Also, from a politician's point of view, they quite liked that in certain ways because it meant that, unlike Joffre, who ran the whole show, they could impose themselves more on Nivelle, or so they thought. And the actual military committee of the parliament took more of a role from 1916 onwards.
Right. Just a quick question, like just for some context here, because Joffre had almost dictatorial control, at least of the military, right? And the government was trying to claw some of that power back.
Exactly. And Nivelle, although not talking about his military judgment, we're talking about his position and who he could rely on. He was sort of isolated to a certain extent. And from the point of view of the politicians looking to oversee or, in inverted commas, control him, that was a positive. Plus, you've got the Verdun. When he took over Second Army, it was towards the end of the German offensive, and he was in charge, obviously, when the French started pushing back and retook Vaux and Douaumont by the end of 1916. So in the public side, he was a good thing. And politicians like to be associated with success.
Right.
So if they see Nivelle, or those that support him saw Nivelle, wanted to be associated with him, let's get him on board. He's new, he's not tarnished with any of the old baggage like the old guard was. Bring him in. Nivelle thought this was fantastic, but he was, because of it risen from the low ranks towards the top, he wasn't an experienced political player. And he didn't see, in my opinion, that it was being, perhaps used is too strong a word, but if you see what I mean by that, that he was there to help the politicians out.
He's being positioned by the politicians. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Wow. Jim thinks on that.
Yeah. Oh, no, fully agree. And I think one of the things that anybody of any sort of level of command needs is the security of what command is above him. And, for example, Haig had Robinson as the chief of the general staff, very much an ally, someone to protect him against the government and so on.
Right.
And we'll come into that a little bit later on when the various things in January, February unfold. But Nivelle really never had that. And he never felt that he had people above him who had confidence in him. It was sort of like, I didn't ask for this, and now you're not really giving me the backing. There was a change of war minister at the same, because what's going on politically is there's been a massive change. Briand was prime minister. Poincaré was the president, but Briand was, I think, the third prime minister by then. I think he's the second time as prime minister during the war. This is that's how things change in France quite quickly.
Yes, yeah, turmoil.
It's not like one party goes out and another party comes in. There's a sort of rearrangement of whatever
musical chairs, really.
Okay, gotcha.
It's my turn to be prime minister now, so type of thing. But they do want that role because they feel it's powerful. And Briand's become that. But because of the difficulties of Joffre and various other things, he makes changes in his own ministry as well. He tries to change things. He tries to create a war cabinet in the same way that Lloyd George did. It didn't really work the same way, but he did. And one of the positions he changed was war minister. And at this time, there's no head of the Army General Staff. That post has never been filled since the beginning of the war because they were combined between. Joffre was given both roles. It's complicated coming up to the war, but there were two roles. One of them was going to be Commander-in-Chief and one was General Staff. To make it easier, that combined in Joffre in the end. So there wasn't this position. So there wasn't this next military man up to bounce things off, to discuss things with, to be the link to the parliamentary side of things, the politicians. That didn't exist. And the war minister, as things started to unfold, had been brought back by Briand from Morocco. And it was Hubert, I think it's Lautet. Hubert Lautet. And he came back. He didn't really like Nivelle. He didn't like the fact that Nivelle had been chosen. He would have chosen Foch or Petain. But also, there wasn't really a massive feeling from the politicians about Nivelle's thought processes with regard to the battles. Because in the same way the French army had this fight between the scientific battle, and we've heard this in 16 in the talks in 16 between the scientific battle and the breakthrough type of battle, the rapid breakthrough battle. The politicians were also not too sure about that either. They didn't want Petain because they felt he was too defensive, but on the other hand, there were quite a few of them, and Leyte was one of them, felt that Nivelle's ideas were too much like 16 and 15. Isn't it just the same thing? Aren't you just trying to do the same thing with even more men and more guns? But the Germans have more men and more guns. Isn't going to be the same. He wouldn't have felt secure. And that was going to pan out over the next few months. That was to come to fruition, really.
I have a question here, and you don't have to answer it now. Maybe it's just something you can think of, and we can put it in the episode notes for the podcast. Would you have a book that you would recommend on the French Third Republic, just so folks could get really a lot of context on the history of French politics leading up to this time?
I've got a couple of books down, but I've not got them here to sort of say this one and this one.
Yeah. You can just email me later. I was just thinking of that.
I'll email you what the bibliography I've got down in the studio, which is I've got my books here. They're all down in another place. There are a few around. The problem with it is that the Third Republic is until 1940. So basically, it's 70 years. So
it's a big period.
Yeah. Go on, Steve. You might
say for a quick snapshot to see how French politics compares to, say, British politics or American politics. It's worth just looking at a list of French governments over, say, 1890 to the end of the war, and see how many different ministers and some of the short periods of different prime ministers there's been, and so on. And it gets you some idea. But what you notice is the same names keep appearing in different roles, and they tend to swap around a lot. The one consistent during the First World War was Poincaré as president. He was president throughout the First World War. And that's why when he backed Nivelle, it carried so much weight, because he'd been there all the time. He was president. And so it helped sway things. But regarding prime ministers, until they got to Clemenceau, there wasn't a prime minister that served for more than 2 years during the First World War. And some served for, month, 2 months. So it was continually changing.
Interesting.
I'm just looking one thing up, because even now, if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty of how the French army was developing before the war and how politics affected it, then the translation of Michel Goya's, which is to English, is Flesh and Steel During the Great War. Because that's not just a description of the war, it's a description of the French army. And it has a lot at the beginning about the effects of politicians on the French army before the war and then during the war. So that read, and it's now, as I said, in English translation and readily available, is an incredibly good read to get that insight into the French army. And I think instead of finding yourself embattled with this massive idea of the Third Republic and all the intricacies of that, if you want it on the army, I think Michel Goya's book, it's Flesh and Steel During the Great War, in English translation.
Great.
That is the one, I think, which will give military historians a quick insight into what I've just been talking about, how the French army was always influenced by this republic idea, and the fact the republic always felt it had to defend itself. And would this commander-in-chief basically try and take over government? That was actually said at times. And Foch, one of the great fears about Foch was that he had the drive and the popularity to maybe turn the army against the government and to bring the whole republic down.
Wow.
And that was always still a fear amongst the republic.
Makes me think of I don't think so much nowadays, but in post-Ottoman Turkey for many decades, the army was seen as the guarantor of Turkish democracy. This is very much not the case with the French army in the Third Republic. The army is a potential threat to the Republican government.
Correct.
How interesting! Correct. Really interesting. Also, I really wish I had a better radio persona, because folks, Flesh and Steel is actually the next book that we are reading for the BFWP book club. I will release that date probably in April. So boy, that just tied in perfectly, guys. Thank you so much. Now you really need to go out and read it and take notes. There's going to be a lot to talk about. So fantastic. All right. You mentioned earlier the overall plan for 1917 is the same as 1916. Like, just, obviously keep attacking the enemy and try to find some vantage point here from which you can start to win here. Now, you said that Nivelle is not so much a scientific guy; he's more of the per se, the breakthrough battle. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. He takes the plans for 1916 and doesn't. If you look at the plans for 16 and what actually happens in 17 under Nivelle, they're not massively different. It's just that Nivelle is concentrating a little bit more on what I would call a two front attack around what is called the Noyon Bulge.
Okay. Yes.
The Germans hold the city of Noyon, and it does if you look at a map of the Western Front at the end of 1916, there's a bit of a bulge out. It's not a very obvious one, but there's a bit of a bulge out there. And it's a clear thing that Joffre was thinking of attacking that as well, to be honest. I think when people think about Nivelle doing something completely different, how Joffre's plans would have turned out would probably have not been massively different. Maybe attacking in different areas, maybe more on the Somme than it would have been further south. It would have been more of a Battle of the Somme type of part
Okay.
3, 4, 5, whatever. But that was how Nivelle type, in a sense, came out with that type of plan. But his whole idea was the breakthrough. His idea was the British would attack around Arras, or between Arras and Bapaume.
Mm-hmm.
That he would have basically a northern army which was around the sort of that bulge, in a sense of facing the bulge, and
Yep.
that would attack a few days later, and then a major attack would happen coming from the south. So if you look at it on a map, it looks like a reasonably good idea, because the Germans would be worried, because if either of those, it's in a sense a pincer around the Noyon Gap, and so the plan itself had a lot of merit, and so that was not massively different. But the idea was that both Haig was supposed to break through, and then that would draw German reserves away from where the main army, the reserve army, would be attacking around the sort of Soissons, Reims area, and that would be the Chemin des Dames sort of attack, and that would therefore be able to actually break through, and the whole war would be over. And that's where Nivelle's immaturity starts to come in, because he's talking about what's going to happen, and people at the time are listening to him and saying, have you not been around for the last 2 years? You're talking about, we'll break through there and break through there, and then we'll decide whether we're going for the coast or we're going to go for the Rhine. It was, and people who had experience the last 2 years in a sense in higher command just basically were thinking, well, okay. But Haig, as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, was listening to these plans and was not totally against them. And I think a lot of people, you read some sources where it talks about Haig didn't like what Nivelle was doing from the start. That is untrue. The letters between them in late December 16 and in January 17, Haig is very supportive, but only on certain terms. Okay. And those terms are really important that are happening around that time, because the terms are that he will support Nivelle in his attack. Privately in his own diary, Haig thinks he's a little bit too ambitious. But so is Haig in times as well. So he's been a little bit hypocritical there. But yes, he was being overly ambitious, but the plan had merits. I think that's even Haig's words. But one of the things which for Haig was really important is that Nivelle said that if it doesn't succeed in the first 48 hours, he will stop. And then he'll turn his resources to what Haig wants, which is to move into Flanders and take the northern coast. Okay. So I either break through and I start winning, which means we don't have to worry about the northern coast anyway, because the Germans will be on the run. Or I don't succeed and I stop and I support you by taking over more of the line, and I support you in moving up to Flanders and attacking at Ypres, which has always been what Haig wanted. And I think that was, I don't know where Nivelle got that from, but someone somewhere had told him, you must give this carrot to Haig. in terms of you are going to be able to go to Ypres and do what you wanted to do at some point this year, one way or another, or you're not going to need to because we've all broken through. That all goes wrong eventually, but that's for later on in the podcast, really.
Wow. So I think, is there anything more that we can add about Robert Nivelle? He seems, he's, like you said, like he doesn't bring the baggage that like Foch, de Castelnau and the others would bring. But then again, he's also rather inexperienced. He seems, very like ridiculously clueless, or perhaps overly confident of like having to, well, you're the guy in charge, you better like sell this thing. So like, yeah, we're going to break through. It's going to be great. Big pincer attack, it's genius. Watch me. And like, is there anything else we can say about it before
I think we need to talk about Nivelle and it, because it then drags on into the planning and the launch of it, because he's still having meetings with politicians about the offensive, even after the artillery barrages commence. And the reason being is, as we talked about earlier, what we forgot to add is a lot of politicians were serving soldiers. So, for example, Albert Messermy, who was a deputy, was Minister of War in August 14. He then went off, not to Bordeaux with the rest of the politicians. He joined a chasseurs battalion in the Vosges, fought with them, fought on the Somme, was decorated several times. And by now, it rose, it was a colonel at the time, but he knew, because of his time as Minister of War, he knew a lot of obviously a lot of politicians. He was still a deputy, right, but he knew a lot of army commanders. And Michelin, for example, one of the commanders who was going to lead the offensive, was very cautious, and he confided into Messermy. Messermy had his own thoughts, and he wrote a letter to, that was Bryant or Ribot had taken over by then. He wrote several letters cautioning that, do we really need this offensive now? Have we? Yes, our manpower is not too bad, but could we take another huge hit that big offensive could lead? Is it not better waiting until the end of 17 or second half of 17 when we've got more munitions, we've got more bigger guns to take forward? Is it not just to? And that's just one example, but other reports were being fed back to certain politicians, and there were several meetings between politicians and Nivelle about the offensive. Not that they wanted to get rid of Nivelle because they'd in effect appointed him and they were looking in a bad light, but more they wanted to rein him in, and because they couldn't afford politically to have another big costly defeat in the war. The last meeting, for example, was I think 6th of April, something like that. And what happened was Nivelle offered his resignation.
Right.
And they were taken aback because that's not really what they hadn't thought about. Well, actually, what we're going to just appointed him. And by that time, the Prime Minister had changed. It was Ribot. Ribot had been Prime Minister 3 times before, the first 2 in the 1890s, but he'd also been Prime Minister for just 4 days in June 1914. He'd only been Prime Minister since the 20th of March. And he said, blinking heck, I'm going to be on record for the 2 shortest prime ministerial terms in history. So he was very conscious that he knew that it was caught between a cleft stick. A costly offensive might cost him his premiership. Similarly, if he got rid of Nivelle so soon after they employed him without anyone in to replace him, might cost him his premiership. So at the last minute, they all sort of chickened out sort of thing. And Nivelle had called the bluff and got away with it.
I think when you go, his character, you begin to see the cracks in his character in February when things go astray with the British.
Okay.
And the incident in Calais has to be brought in here, and it's a demonstration of where he was a pawn in a bigger game, and a political game he didn't really have any understanding of. Okay. And the background to that is that he actually wanted the offensive to begin very early in the year. In the same way the Germans started Verdun in February in the previous year, he wanted the offensive to start in February. He wanted it that early. And things dragged. And to some extent, they would, for all sorts of reasons, but one of the reasons it dragged was because Haig was not going to be rushed that way. And there were all sorts of things. And there were little bits. Haig was quite a wily character by now. And he had the backing of a number of different people in the military in London. And so he began to drag his feet in all sorts of ways. He complained about the railways. He complained that there wasn't enough railway to get his troops into place that early around Arras and so on. The infrastructure wasn't there. The French trains weren't running properly or anything, properly enough. Not going into massive detail there, but it caused the government in Britain. Lloyd George had become prime minister at the end of 16. He was very happy with an idea of a Nivelle offensive, mainly because it was mainly French troops being involved, not British. But he was already thinking of the idea of a unified command. And the French also would love to have a unified command, something that wasn't going to happen until 1918 in the most extreme situations.
Mm-hmm.
But they wanted one then. They felt that the way the two armies worked together was sometimes contrary. The Somme had shown that there was elements of the two the two sort of armies not working together. And so a unified command was felt the way forward. And Lloyd George agreed with that. And he felt the French should take command. And he had the rather strange idea that the British Army would just be perfectly happy with being under control of a French commander-in-chief. Mm. And that's where I think Lloyd George was being a little bit naive there and thinking that they'd just roll over and accept it. We'll not go into the massive machinations that were going on, but Nivelle was in the middle of all of this. And there was a paper created for Nivelle to read out in a meeting in February at Calais.
Yes.
And he basically read this paper. He read this out in a very sort of stuttery way and not really making it clear what he wanted. He was just talking about command and that we should be working with one command, but not saying, I think I should be in command of all the troops, including British, because he didn't know how to put this argument forward. And it led to a massive fallout especially between the British, Haig and Robertson, and Lloyd George. And they fell out massively. And eventually there was a compromise type solution where the British Army was under command would do as they were told, so to speak, with the French for the duration of the campaign, as long as it didn't put the British Army in any danger whatsoever. So Haig wasn't happy at all. And then Nivelle showed his extra naivety in the weeks that followed by allowing letters to go, because they weren't actually written by him, but he allowed them to go to Haig, which made it, there were letters that sounded as if he was writing them to a subordinate.
Ooh.
And it really made, when Haig got them, his hackles rose. And he complained to London, London complained to Paris, everybody was complaining to each other. And eventually another conference was held in London, which interestingly Briand didn't go to because he was so frightened about losing. It was almost like a dictator doesn't leave his capital because he thinks that he's going to fall while he's away. He doesn't leave because that's where the politics are lying in France at that moment. But they have another meeting and it's all ironed out a little bit, but they really are not getting on at this time. This is where that whole command structure and the whole political miniaturations that Steve talked about, where nobody's really making a commanding decision properly, is going on. And then what really shows Nivelle's weakness is what happens is that the Germans get involved because they change everything. Because the whole of the plan has its aim on this Noyon bulge. Mm-hmm. But what do the Germans do? They pull out the bulge. They withdraw. The background to that is that Hindenburg and Ludendorff had taken over high command back in September 16.
Right.
They had gone to the Western Front and gone, it's horrible here.
Right.
Being the wide open spaces of the Eastern Front with massive movement everywhere and so on and so forth, finding this stagnant front to them. And what their first thought was, we need to not have that bulge. It will save us around 6 or 7 divisions by pulling back to a line. But we'll not do it straight away. We'll create a line to pull back to.
Right.
They created then began to create the Siegfriedstellung, which we all call the Hindenburg line. Mm-hmm. So the Siegfriedstellung was going to be a fortified line to withdraw to, very heavily fortified, very deep trenches, very well bombed, and that it was, where finished, it was a very formidable defensive thing. And in February they began to withdraw. In March they really did withdraw. It was what's called Operation Albrecht, he's the nasty character out of the Nibelungen.
Okay,
that's why it was named after him.
Okay,
and it's not a race back to the Siegfried line. They go back in stages. So it's not that the British or the French can just race after them. They find that everything's difficult. There are intermediate lines created, in a sense, the standard military style withdrawal form. And also, what the Germans did in that area between where they'd been and where they withdrew to, they basically used a scorched earth technique to make that area very difficult to live in once the British or the French armies went into it. They destroyed wells. It sometimes said they poisoned them. Well, in some respects they did, they threw dead cattle down them. It wasn't poison as such in order to kill British or British French soldiers. It was just to make them unusable. They cut down fruit trees, which the French hated them for that. You can knock our farms down, our houses down, but you've destroyed our fruit trees. That was awful.
There would be hell to pay post-war, where like the French were like, you will pay for every tree.
So there'd be so the British and the Allies and the French were moving into a barren landscape, and they couldn't move very quickly. And the Germans had various troops left behind to hold back for a little while. So it was an ordered withdrawal. But it changed everything. It changed the whole structure. The central attack by Northern Army Group was not really there anymore. They were still catching up. When we're getting into near April now, when the whole thing was going to be kicking off. And any real commander-in-chief of merit, and I think Foch or Petain especially, would at this point have said, whoa, right, scrap everything.
Right.
Reevaluate what we're going to do, if anything, this year. Because at this point, the Americans have come into the war. The Russian Revolution has started. Politically around the world, the whole situation has changed. And to take stock of everything and decide how we're going to go forward, did they have to attack with the situation in Russia? Because that's what they thought they had to do to support the Russians, and the Russians were going to be attacking at the same time. Did they have to? It was all questionable. And Nivelle he was stubborn. So he was not only, in a sense, inexperienced in his dealings with the British, his dealings with politicians. He was also he showed a stubbornness that a military commander cannot show. And I think that's where all of the things that you can, in a sense, are mitigating for him in what happens in 1917, in the way the politicians are working him or using him, even they don't know what they want or what they're doing. And as Steve said, they could have actually moved commander and decided they could have stepped in and said, it's changed, Nivelle. Either change your ideas or you're out. They didn't have any power either. Everybody was weak, basically.
Right. Nobody has a clear idea of what they want and what they're looking for. And then the Germans upend everything, and there's no pause for reflection and like, hey, let's take a breath and let's figure out what is the best next step here. Amazing.
One of the things worth mentioning at this point, although Jim may discuss a bit later on, is operational security. Because one of the things Nivelle was even worse at was operational security. And one of the reasons was because of his political insecurity, as it were. He was trying to get all these politicians on board, so he shared the quite detailed plans going back to the beginning of the year with all the politicians to try and get them all on board. There's jokes, even the waiters in Paris knew what the plans were. Everybody knew what these things were. When he went to the meeting in London, he talked about the plans in front of the serving staff didn't have security clearance. So everybody knew, in effect, that there's going to be some big offensive, and they know roughly where it was. The Germans certainly, which we'll come on to later on, but part of that operational security collapse is because he was seeking to share information with perhaps too many people to try and get them on board to back his ideas.
Wow. So let's get into those plans and I think we'll probably talk more about like the operational security, like talking about that Nivelle offensive. So what was the plan? And I have this as a two-part question. What was the plan and what happened when the attack was launched? So we know that it's in the Chemin des Dames. That's, if you're roughly thinking, folks, it's northeast of Paris, heading towards the direction of Soissons and Rennes, but not. Chemin des Dames is actually...
Yeah, if you have a triangle with Lyon at the top, Soissons and Reims, it runs roughly across the two diagonals at the top, the Chemin des Dames.
Right, right. Very famous area, of course. The ladies' path that's what Shimandadam means. So the plan is to attack there. What are they trying to do? What happens once the attack is launched?
Well, the first attack is the 9th of April in Arras. That's the British Army attack first.
Okay.
And then on the 16th of April, the Reserve Army is to attack with 3 armies. And the whole idea is, not a particularly bad one, is that 5th and 6th Army are on both flanks. And the idea is they attack first and basically weaken and break through the German defences to allow the 10th Army in the centre to burst through. And the whole idea is that they burst through an already disorganised German defensive system after 5th and 6th Army have done the business. And then they break out and they they destroy the gun lines by fanning out, very blitzkrieg style, if you think about it from the Second World War point of view. Fan out, destroy the gun lines, and then everything goes, everybody hurtles off to the Rhine or somewhere. At the same time, the British are doing a similar thing from the north, so the Germans should then be in total disarray. That's the general plan. And you've got, there's a massive army that he's doing down there, because each of the armies, 5th Army, Marzel's army is 14 divisions. Marjan's army, 6th Army, which is the one on the left-hand side, if you look at the western side, is also 14 divisions. And then 10th Army sitting in wait is another 12 divisions. So this is a massive undertaking.
Yes.
If it had gone in February, it might have met a whole different defensive system. However, the Germans have got something like around 3 times more divisions in that area now than they had in February. Oh, I wonder why.
Right.
Because they knew exactly what was coming.
Right.
Now, to describe the Chemindé as well, when you look on a map, you go from Soissons, you need to follow the N, or the Anne, I'm never quite sure how you pronounce it, but the N River. I've heard it pronounced the Anne as well, which is a bit weird. But anyway, the N River, which is the AISNE when you're looking at it. It runs basically around this particular area. It's running from west to east. It's running, it's got a line across. It's that lower triangle line in some respects. And the Chemindé rises above it. And the Germans are there because that's where they went. That's where they retired to in 1914 after the First Battle of Marne. They knew the significance of that. They thought, instead of trying to hold the river line, which is always a difficult one to hold, we'll hold the heights. And so they retreated onto the heights and dug in there. And they'd been digging in there, and the French have been trying to knock each other, hell bells out of each other for nearly the remaining part of the war so far. Any British people around who are visiting there, they will find there are cemeteries there from 14, because the British were held there in 14. It was the British Army that was following up in 1914, in September 14. So that's a big ridge, and the French are not quite on it. So the plan is really for these 2 attacks, basically on the 2 sides of the Chemindé Dam, to begin to put pressure on the Germans so that 10th Army will then burst through the centre of the Chemindé Dam. Not a bad plan when you think that if the plan was just to attack straight on, you're trying to attack onto a very fortified ridge. Now, the problem for Nivelle is that his whole success in Verdun had laid on terrain that was just basically an absolute moonscape of nothing.
Right.
Where there were no trenches, nobody could dig trenches or dig dugouts or whatever. He was attacking, and once you've got the artillery support that you want, and your objective is only about 4 or 5 kilometers to take, which is what it was at Verdun, well, you're going to succeed probably, because you're going to blast the Germans out. They're going to retire. They're going to let the French take Vaux and Douaumont because they're not worth keeping, because this landscape, the Chemindé Dam's not that. They've been there since September 14. So any defences, yes, the line had moved slightly, but most defences, they dug in. It's chalk. They dug in deep. It's got deep dugouts. It's got cave systems. You can visit a cave system there,
yes,
which is a great place to visit. And then those proliferate along the ridge. And dugouts were everywhere. And it was just not the sort of place it wasn't the same. And Nivelle didn't understand that was not going to work in the same way it worked at Verdun. Yeah. And so that was the general plan for these 3 armies to basically break through. And the 16th of April, they went. The 2 flanking armies went in. not massively unsuccessfully. It's not the disaster that people tend to then. You think about the Shamanda. Oh, they attacked and it was useless. It was a waste of time and it was failed. It just failed. In terms of what had gone before, some of the work, the attacks that went on, especially in those first few days, were relatively successful.
Okay.
I think it was on the Fifth Army, that's on the right. They advanced 4 kilometers on the first day. They basically went through the first couple of German lines, and they took a large number of prisoners. And I think Marsdin had a little bit more trouble on the left-hand side, but on both sides, it wasn't a particular total failure on the first day. So the first day is very much like any other day. So you could, at the war so far, we would look at it as high casualties, horrible casualties. They were high, but this is we're talking multiple divisions attacking on both of these flanks. But the Germans were using a defense in depth now that they had never used before. So that was not a breakthrough in any way, shape, or form. The Germans almost allowed some of that area to be taken,
right?
Because their idea was that in the next few days they would counterattack. They'd counterattack against tired, depleted units that had taken. The Germans had got reserve divisions that were going to be they're basically the counterattack divisions. They're named that, and they were going to then take over. And that's basically what begins to happen on the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th. What begins to happen on both flanks is that the pressure is actually almost reversed. That this German counterattacks start coming in, and any further progress starts to look very doubtful. So that's where the whole thing starts to unravel. And Nivelle is also got a problem, because that first attack is not the big breakthrough in the first 24 hours that everybody wanted. So the talk back with the politicians, as that word gets back, and as Steve said, it gets back very quickly because of the connections between, I mean, the 10th Army commander is Michelet, the one who's going to be supposedly going through and going to the next stop Rhine, is actually this politically collected person. So when he sees that this is happening, of course, the politicians hear about it very quickly, and it's all doom and gloom back in Paris, basically. There's no sort of, they've been successful to some extent, they may need to attack again. It's not that. It's been a disaster, it's dreadful, so the politics of it starts to fall apart. So this period of April now, between the attack going in, and by this point, when you're getting to the April the 20th, the British have tried again on April the 23rd to take pressure off by attacking again. Haig is doing his bit, really, because he's hearing. Right. And then you get a sort of a situation where nobody wants to stop. So the whole idea of it is not succeeding, so we could actually stop the offensive. And many generals have said after the war, when they write, that actually to stop an offensive is not that easy, unless you all go back to the start points. Right. But on the other hand, you could argue that what they could have done is not just sent divisions in to take over the line and dig in and actually hold that line and say, we've not succeeded. They'd taken some more of the Chemin des Dames. About 3 or 4 kilometers of the Chemin des Dames on Marsdin's side, the western side, had been taken. And so they could have dug in, they got high ground there, they could have stopped. I regard it as not impossible they could have stopped. But even Haig, who wanted it actually to be a situation where if it wasn't that successful, can we stop and I go up to Flanders? He was wanting the French to continue to attack. So there was almost even Haig changed his sort of attitude. Right. It's a mission creep idea.
Yeah. I mean, the big irony is if Nivelle had done what he'd promised to Haig and what he'd promised to I think it was the penultimate meeting with the politicians, if it wasn't a success in 48 hours, it would stop. He probably lasted in command a bit longer because, as Jim said, until then, the losses weren't too bad. They'd made some gains, but it was the fact that it kept being pushing more troops to the slaughter, in effect, in the weeks to come, that cost him dearly, because that's what the politicians couldn't afford, because they could see, particularly with the revolution in Russia in February 17, not only were they concerned about an army takeover, they were concerned also about revolution in France itself. If there was too much public unquiet,
Right.
And on the Chimamanda Dam itself, reinforce, if you were to pick somewhere on the Western Front in 1917 where not to attack with a frontal attack, you would be hard pushed to find somewhere other than the Shannon with the worst possible place, because it's 180 metres higher than the surrounding Ain Valley. The French built some forts on there in the 19th century, Cé de Rivières. Two of those forts were now occupied by the Germans, Fort de Malmaison and de Bremont, and they'd reinforced them. Not only had the defence in depth, part of that defence in depth was on the reverse slope, like Wellington put. They put all their machine gun posts, so when they came at those where they managed to get to the top of the ring and advanced over, as soon as they come over the top of the hill, they were mown down. It was just it's worth a site visit if you possibly can. Look on Google Earth. You can just think, why did the attack there?
Right. In fact, I was just thinking while you guys were describing the ridge, if you've ever stood at the Basque Division Monument on the Chemin des Dames, it's the monument with the Basque gentleman, and he's facing south towards his homeland. That offers a terrific view of why that Chemin des Dames was so important. Like it commands the countryside to the south, and that was what the Germans were holding. Incredible. Yeah.
I think the point is the French could have taken the ridge. There was enough power and firepower to take the ridge and then hold it. And if they'd have only had that in mind with the amount of troops they had and so on and so forth, they could well have done that and held the commanding position. And they did over many straits of it. For the rest of 1917, they held commanding position on the Chemin des Dames. And in fact, when it comes down to 18, they're, in a sense, they are holding. The Germans eventually break through that in 18, but they are because they're holding that high ground. But what starts to happen then is you get not only mission creep, but yes, they're attacking a very. But one of the reasons why the plan was to attack, in a sense, from both flanks. If when you look at that from a plan point of view, you see they're not actually. The Nivelle plan wasn't actually to attack straight at the line of the ridge. But that's what it turned into, because he basically then sent 10th Army into what wasn't really a gap. And so they then found themselves trying to get on top of there. But it was also widened. There were attacks in the Champagne. And a lot of people think that was only what happened. Other armies were then brought in. I think 4th Army it was in Champagne. They were told to attack. It was almost like almost a panic of, if we're not going to get through here, we'll try somewhere else. Even though they were never going to succeed because there wasn't the artillery there, because it was all on the Chemin des Dames area. They hadn't got the support, they hadn't got the firepower to break through again. So we were wasting. Everybody found themselves involved in some form of attack, and it lingered. That lingered through the end of April. This absolute, and into May almost. Well, into May, yes.
Yes.
The end of into May. It's this lingering attempt to do something. And it also happened to the British Army, because British Army attacked on the 3rd of May, and it was a disastrous day. It was the second worst day for the British Army after the Somme. The first day of the Somme, the 3rd of May. The casualties were horrendous, and they made no progress. It's all just this idea that they... people, I think historians, military historians keep coming back to the First World War, that the generals seem to not want to stop. In hindsight, it's easy, obviously, to say, why didn't you stop that way? But pressures seemed to be so intense that they couldn't stop. And Nivelle was meeting people all the way through. And then what happens on, try and get the date right, when on the 15th, let's get the dates right. No, it's not the 15th who takes over. They make Petain chief of the general staff, the post that never existed.
Okay.
The politicians interfere again. They're not happy with what's going on, but they haven't got they feel they can't, as Steve said, removing commander in the middle of a battle like this is seen as a weakness that might make the whole government fall. Mm-hmm. And what you've got in the War Minister now is Painlevé, who eventually becomes Prime Minister as well in this sort of rotation that they do.
Right.
He is the one who, he does not like Nivelle, and but he also sees that he brings in Petain and he puts him in this post, which has been basically sat idle, which is then held by people for the rest of the war. But he puts Petain in that role. And basically it's in order for Petain to start to reel Nivelle in. But even Petain doesn't really do that. Where people have talked about the offensive going on too far, even he is responsible for agreeing that the attacks go on. So it's not that latter part where the French army begins to really start to lose it. Petain is also involved in that. It may be because he doesn't understand or doesn't realise, he's not on the ground, how bad things have got. I don't know. Obviously, we're going to talk later, another time, about how he reacts to the whole situation in the French army afterwards. But you've got that situation where he's now finding he's got a superior again. He's got Petain, in a sense, a superior. So he's now in a real quandary. That period, militarily, there's all sorts of things going on. There's no point going into this is attacking or that's attacking. Just it's chaos.
Right.
It's literally chaos, chaotic attacks, large number of losses. The French generals don't really know what they're doing anymore. They are totally not wanting to do what Nivelle's telling them to do. It really is absolute chaos within the French army. If the Germans had any idea, and this is not to do with mutinies, any idea about the chaotic situation within the command of the French army, they might have actually done, been even more reactive. I don't know, but it's like that, and it's the French soldiers that are hanging on at this point. I think Elizabeth Greenlay puts it in terms of the whole of the 1917 saga, that it was the politicians and the generals who were messing everything up, but it was the soldier who paid the price.
Right.
It was who paid the price of all of that.
Right. And interesting here about Petain as well, that he, as you just said, he also was advocating for continued attacks on the Chemin des Dames. And that's not always the story that you get. I know Alex Lyons talks a lot about the cult of Petain in French history circles, in cleaning up his image. And it's funny, like the more you dig in, you mentioned earlier that, eventually the Germans are going to break through on the Chemin des Dames in 1918. And I did just do a podcast episode on that recently. So 1918, Blucher-York, one of the big German offensives, the Germans plow right through French Sixth Army because the French Sixth Army wasn't doing defense in depth. It was tough in that area to do that, but they could have done something. But Petain exempted them. And then less than 2 weeks later, the Germans attack again at the Mats and near Noyon, and French Third Army there also exempted from doing defense in depth, which was Petain's some of his very ideas. So you're starting to just get this image wow, you are not as clean in all of this as I thought you were here, General Petain. Well, so it's just interesting.
Going back even to before the offensive took place, when we mentioned that some of the generals were against the offensive, Petain was one of those. But when he was given the chance to speak at the meeting, he suddenly kept quiet, went stum. He didn't want to. He never comes across as a very forthright character. A very trustworthy character, I would think, when you look at Petain and his dealings with his contemporaries.
Interesting.
I think that what happens then is that they turn to Petain to become commander-in-chief. They eventually have to get rid of Nivelle.
Right.
It's not the 15th of May. That's when Petain takes over as commander-in-chief. And the disposal of Nivelle then is quite horrendously rapid and whatever. He's sent on leave with the pay of an army group commander, so a fairly high level of command.
Okay.
After that leave of a few weeks, it's then said there's no army group for you, and he's sent to somewhere in Africa.
Yes.
I'm not sure where, but he's sent to somewhere in Africa to take over some posts there, and he never gets back to the Western Front for the rest of the war. He isn't invited to the Victory Parade in Paris. He is really put out to pasture, and he dies in 24. So he doesn't really have many years afterwards even though he's a young man in comparative to, when you think of Petain's much older than him.
Right.
Goes on to the Second World War. But he dies quite early, probably a broken man, I would have thought. There's no real evidence of that. But
I mean, he did write several times. He did write several times asking for an army command on the Western Front after dismissing that. He was very bitter, upset by it.
I mean,
ironically, as a corps commander on a smaller unit, might have been okay, but scaling up to commander of the overall French army, it was promoted above his, well, we said promoted with a pay grade, I think, beyond his capabilities.
Yeah, he could well have been a capable army group commander.
Yeah,
I mean, if for example, Castelnau had been made commander in chief at any particular point, who was an army group commander, he could well have taken over that army group and been, especially the Eastern Army Group, the one down south, opposite the Vosges zone, because we didn't do nothing for the rest of the war, or not very much for the rest of the war. He would have been fine, and he would probably have come out of the end of the war and probably been made a marshal, or not that maybe, but he certainly would have been in the victory parade and all the rest of it. But there was on Nivelle, so the last thing on Nivelle to some extent, there was a sort of reconciliation to some extent. I think it's 1920. He'd been dead a couple of years, but I think it was 1926 where they actually reinterred his ashes into des Invalides with all the other marshals and so on. So he's there now as a general of France. And so I think there was a sort of, maybe we were a little bit, as governments changed, I think one government must have said, I think we've got to reconcile this. And there is a recent book on Nivelle by a French author, which does put the whole thing in a little bit more perspective of his being really promoted beyond where he was capable of doing it. It wasn't, in a sense, not his fault fully. The fault of the people above him not allowing him to develop or not giving him the guidance and then not supporting him and then not telling him to step down when he should have done. Saying, look, we made a mistake, mate. I don't think you should have this position. And accepting when he said, well, if that's when he said at that meeting, as Steve said, I think I should resign. They should have said, well, okay then, bye.
You should. Yes, you're right.
We accept your resignation, and we'll move on from there.
Yeah,
I mean that's one of the reasons why when they finally got rid of him, they wanted him well out of the way, a bit like a limogeage, but because he was so high profile, they couldn't quite send him down there, but to North Africa, because they didn't want him commenting, because they knew full well they were really responsible for giving him the job in the first place, which they were, and not necessarily keeping him in check when he should have been.
Wow. Is it true that he never really spoke of it? He left no memoirs. He never complained publicly. He just seemed to like internalize it and just disappeared. Is that the story of the last years of his life?
Well, you say that, as I say, he did write asking for it, but by the time the war was over, and I think he just
It was too late.
It was too much for him.
Yeah. All right.
I think he was a broken man by 1919.
Yeah.
I think not being invited to the victory parade and so on, and being left in Africa in a minor role, I think he just went into retirement and died soon afterwards, sadly. So it's a very sad story in many respects.
Yeah.
And what we haven't mentioned, by the way, in terms of, we should have mentioned it earlier on, he did have an English mother. So when you're talking about the relationships with Lloyd George and the British, he spoke perfectly good English. And to a British general staff of areas whose French is never that great, and Haig's French wasn't that great, the fact that he could actually have conversations in English with people was for them also an asset.
Right.
His mother was English.
Huge. And I recall reading about him. He was also very charismatic.
Yes. Everybody who met him thought I think that's what happened in December 16 and through January. I think it's very, very sad in some respects that he was above his station and acted above his station maybe a little bit too much, which gave people a bit of confidence. But then as soon as they saw that they'd made a mistake, they should have been the ones who were reining him in. So I think it's wrong. And it's the only offensive that's named after somebody. I think that's really the sadder thing about it. And it's named after him as a negative.
And it's forever stains his name.
Yes. Unfortunately, it's the thing of, imagine calling it Third Ypres after calling it the Hague Offensive.
The Hague Offensive, right. We would think of it way differently, right? And actually, this leads to, I'm sorry, Steve, did you have something?
No, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, well, here I am about to continue that tradition, because my next question is, after the Nivelle offensive, what happened with the French army? Was it mutiny, Or was it, as the French historian Nicolas Offenstadt described, more like military strikes, like relating to like labor strikes? And I know
Before
this is
Jim answers this, because Jim's always
I
a
don't
very good
know.
answer to
Yes,
this
Steve,
question,
you might
but
know.
it's wrong to us to state that the work through, I think Jim calls about the strikes or whatever, just came about because of the Chimamanda Dam offensive. It's not true. They've been going on all throughout. Nivelle writes letters to the politicians, to his army commanders, talk about various things about people stirring up trouble, revolutionaries, various workers' groups, and so on. So he's aware of this background, which perhaps also makes him more culpable for then going ahead with an offensive. It's going to cause more unrest. But that's the sign. But there wasn't just one day there was no strikes. The next day there was lots of them. It's been gradually building up.
Yes.
Over the months of the war.
In Verdun already, in the last months of Verdun, French units were already starting to really push things discipline-wise. Like some units were marching towards the front. I've read buying like sheep because they were, lambs to the slaughter and everything. And of course, that doesn't look good for any sort of command of that unit when your guys are acting like that. So yes, absolutely. This didn't happen out of a vacuum.
No. You can lay a lot of blame for what happens in beginning of April, little bits in April, quite a lot in May, then really quite break out in June. What's happening there, you could lay it at Joffre's door. Because since the first part of the war, he had not, as commander-in-chief and the person who would be looking after his armies and his men, he had not really paid much attention to what could be called the morale part of his army and what important elements there are to that morale. For example, leave.
Yes.
For example, food. All the things which for the basic soldier who's in there in the trenches, if you can make sure that A, they get out of those trenches every now and then for a while, and get some leave back home for a while, and they get some reasonable rations and they get reasonably fed, and they have their wine as normal every day. If you look after them in that sense, physically look after them in their moral state, then they will continue to fight for you. And Joffre didn't understand that. I don't think he had realized what this machinery of war, that you're moving all these thousands and hundreds of thousands of men around, that they are still all individual men and they have to be looked after. Some in the British army and the German army, certainly up to 17, had understood. And they'd understood that this sort of thing was necessary, that you rotated, you got people out, you gave them leave. They didn't feel as if they were never going to get out of the trenches. And that was the start of that happening. So all through 16. So that's why there was some ill discipline, even in 16. When it got around to 17, what you've got there is a compounding of all of that. A new commander-in-chief. Well, that must have thought, well, I could well imagine that there have been all sorts of complaints going in again about the possibility of, can we have more leave? Can that be more regimented? Can that be more properly given? Etc., etc. We're eating awful rations. You're not looking after us, even when we're not in the front. And on top of all of that, you've got an increasing number of people coming in who have read about what's happening in Russia. And so you have what are, in a sense, you begin to have what are small Soviets being created within army units. You have people with very left-wing and very communist tendencies who are beginning to, and if you're talking to an audience are basically fed up, it's very easy to make them start to see that the only way we are going to change this is by taking some action.
Right.
And that's why you get the beginnings of all sorts of kinds of action, but not what could be called a mutiny. And I think the problem there is that the French didn't have another name for it. So if you read all of the official, as far as they were concerned, if men didn't do as they were told, they would be mutinous.
Right.
Even though it was in some respects almost a union-like work to rule.
That's it.
Give us our leave, do this for us, and we'll fight for you. And if they come at us, we'll fight. We're not going to run away. We're not deserting. There were desertions, obviously, but that was going on all the time.
Sure.
But overall, units-wise, most of the trouble was one of disobedience, of not I would call it work to rule, as in, you know that from industries where they say, well, we're just going to do not all what we're told, we're just going to do a limited amount of what we're told.
Right.
And part of that is we're not going to go over the top, which is ill discipline. And you could say that's mutinous. So it's all that argument could be made, but it wasn't the friendship were falling apart. And how many incidents, and the problem again with official paperwork there is a lot of official paperwork disappeared. About a quarter of the paperwork around that time has gone. And
Really?
the French diaries, yes, about the French diaries are not very clear on it either, because they're normally written by commanding officer or adjutants and that sort of thing. So they're not clear about this happened or that happened. And so commentators about this have been anywhere from 70 up to 120 different episodes of disobedience or whatever. I think it was 77th Division was one of the most serious ones over 2 days. There were some very quite serious ones. But none of it ever put the French army in any radical danger. I think that's what's really important. A lot of people say, oh, if the Germans had known what was going on, they could have attacked and wiped them all out. No, they couldn't. Because the units that were on the front lines were on the front lines and they were defending. And because they knew that they had to defend their lives.
Right.
They weren't turning around and running away or abandoning trenches. They were still attacked by the Germans through this period of time. The Germans were still attacking in May. There were attacks on the Chemin Dam by the Germans, pushed back by the French, held back by the French. The French did not give much ground at that time. So they were fighting. All through this period of supposed disobedience, they were fighting.
Right.
It wasn't if they all went on strike and if the Germans had realised the war would have been over. And that's far from it. They were fighting. But in the rear parts where troops might have gone up or been told they were going to they might say, we will go and take over a line from somebody, but we're not going to attack.
That's it. Yes. Yes.
And so, and that was only certain units as well. So it wasn't overall through the army. So it was this culmination, and it was not that difficult for Petain when he took over to see that there was an underlying cause to this. It wasn't just an offensive that had failed. They'd all had that. Many of these men had been through that. It was discontent with their lot, their personal everyday lot. And that's how he managed to get the French army back into a very good shape quite quickly, because he just increased leave. Yes, he had some people executed because there were incidences where people had, and I think, although the evidence is a bit scant for that, the writers are hesitant to say it, but it was more the people who were running the Soviets that found themselves maybe at the end of a very serious court-martial. And hundreds were actually sentenced to be dead, to be shot, but many weren't. Only a handful were in the end, because by then the French were not actually executing that many soldiers by 17. But it lessened as the war went on. So I think you've got to see the French army not as a sort of total disaster at this point. I think that's what's really that any listeners have got to understand, that it's still a functioning army, but it's got its massive internal problems. So if you put on that, keep going on that industrial type comparative, it's still producing the goods.
Right.
It's doing it less effectively and not actually pushing out any new goods at the moment. They're just getting on with what they know.
Yeah, this has been the whole theme from both of you gentlemen is like the French army has been, like it was not a disaster. It was not on shaky legs at the end of 1916. It was doing just fine, manpower wise, and everything. And then going into this offensive, and even here, like you learned that, like, again, not really mutiny could be defined as mutiny by the army from the army's, rather strict limited view, but more exactly like you said, like a work to rule. You got me from 9 to 5. That's all you get. That's all you get out of me. And I will hold these trenches. I'm not going out there and attacking though. So amazing. That like this has been I think it clears away a lot of this fog of like, the French army was just a mess in 1917. Their leadership certainly sounds like they were flailing, but the army itself, the men on the ground, not so much. So into this indiscipline in May and June, Petain is now commander of the French army. What is he What is he expected to bring? You mentioned that right away he starts to implement leave, and for the men, better food. What else is he expected to bring to the French army? And this will be our final question.
I think basically he makes the decision then that if there are going to be any offensives whatsoever, they're going to be on his terms.
Okay.
His terms are then what Foch would, and interestingly at this point, Foch has become the chief of the general staff as well. So he's back in the light. So there's a sort of a Foch-Petain team going on now when it goes in. And I think Foch is, because of that, Foch is perfectly happy to say, over to you, Petain, you attack as you want to for now. Because I know we've got this weakened situation with the French army. We have to rebuild its confidence in what we're going to do. And Petain's that he is the right man in the right place at that point. Because it's not the French trying to win the war anymore from July onwards for the rest of 17.
Okay.
The eyes all turn to Flanders, and the eyes all turn to Hague, and the British army and the British and Empire armies on that area of north of Ypres. For the French, it was a matter of saying, let's, as Petain did, and we'll took that's up for the second programme really, he then decides on a certain way forward. And Foch is perfectly happy with that. Because he's actually quite happy with something that's not that anyway. There's no pressure on Petain to do something grand,
right?
And that's where it moves into the second part, because the politicians, in a sense, have backed off to some extent by then.
Oh, perfect. By
the end of 17, Clemenceau comes in and he stays a term till the end of the war. But the thing in the background, about 1917, this is from the start to the end of 1917. It's 1970 is the year when French munitions production goes through the roof. Yeah. 15, 16, it's gradually getting better. But at the start of 17, the graph goes almost like a diagonal straight up. That's both munitions, shells, and actually guns. The production of 75, the production of 75 guns, 155 howitzers, long 155s. The production goes through the roof. So it's quite interesting that Messimy sends another letter to the government. I think it's in May this time. And it's quite a long page letter. I'll send it through to you because it makes various suggestions. It picked up from other army commanders. So, for example, one of them was that by now the infantry operates a 37mm cannon. The idea is to give them some confidence that they're advancing. The artillery hasn't destroyed a machine gun position. They can use this gun to destroy the position. You can get through sandbags and wood and some concrete, but not a heavy metal sort of thing.
Right.
But it's a small version of the 75. So Messimy's come with the idea that why not move the 75s under the control of the infantry? Because what he's realised is that all the best French artillery commanders came into the war manning 75s. When the heavy artillery production came online, the best commanders weren't with them, they're still with the 75s. And this idea, it didn't go ahead, but his idea was that the commanders of the best artillery commanders could then move on to the heavy artillery and do more damage. He also draws a very crude graph where he shows manpower decreasing like that and the artillery going on like that. And his idea is that by the second half of 1917, it should primarily be an artillery-driven offensive wherever it is. And there's various other things in there, but it just shows that, they're not talking defeatists. They're just talking ways of winning the war,
right?
Perhaps with a slightly different emphasis. And that's someone who's a politician and a soldier, Messimy.
The other thing
by the end of 1917, logistically, France was in a very good place.
And if they're also, what we did talk about the Chemin Dam, they'd introduced tanks at that point. There were quite a large number of tanks used on the Chemin Dam.
Very au bac, yes.
Not very well.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that the British didn't use them that well over 1917. They used them very badly at Arras. They used old Mark 1, Mark 2s at Arras badly in penny packets, so they were not very effective. The French also didn't use them very well. It was their first mass use of tanks. There was one incident where a column of tanks was trying to move forward, and the lead tank was destroyed, and the others couldn't move. So the Germans just picked the others off in very sort of easy style because they were all stuck behind this one tank. Made mistake, but they learned from that. They were producing tanks, and in the same way the British began to learn about how to use tanks a bit better, they were also learning, and they also learned the disadvantages of the heavy tanks that they created.
Yeah.
So they were already looking at creating something which was much more mobile. And so they were already on the cusp of introducing what became the best tank of the Great War, which is their Renault, their small Renault, because it became much more. So as Steve said, they were moving forward. The artillery, the long barrel 155, it was tracked. It was on tractors. It was pulled by tractors. It was mobile. It could move around. They moved forward in 17 in so much. As Steve said, the munitions have gone on, the armaments, they got the tanks coming in, they got much better mobility. The air was starting to be much different. They were starting to take air superiority.
Yeah.
They were organising that much in a much more greater effective way. They basically had a lot of air control, the control of the air. A lot of the time over the various Shamanda battles, it wasn't so much that they were struggling in that sort of area, and they were already making decisions on how they were going to use the idea of mobile air groups that would move around when on need. All the way through 17, they were still learning about how to fight this war, which meant that, as Steve said, by the time it comes to the latter part of 17 for the next episode, you've got a French army that, although it's gone through all of what it's gone through in terms of the disobedience and etc., is still a very heavily functioning machine, very well functioning machine. It just needs to be led properly and given its confidence back.
That's it.
I think that's what, because if that hadn't happened during that last part of 17, they wouldn't have been the force to be reckoned with in 18 when they came massively from the south to save the British Army during March of 18.
Right.
Probably now for 18 that they did.
Yeah, I'll send you, Mike, some of these graphs from the Clemenceau archive on the.
Oh, perfect! Thank you.
Website. So there's a graphs and Messmer's letter and Nivelle's letters in there to his officers as well.
Perfect. Oh, perfect. Well, okay. Gosh, what a fantastic conversation as always. It's oh man, I look forward to part 1917 part 2 here when we talk about Petain and some of his operations. So this is going to be really, really interesting. Jim, Steve, thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday afternoons, your Saturday evenings here to come on. This has been another great episode in this series, and gosh, what a wonderfully nuanced conversation. I've come away learning so much that and now knowing like whole new areas of things that I don't know and places that I now need to explore. So this is great. This is fantastic. Okay. All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch for the next one.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.